Summer 1993. Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park was being debuted to the masses. UB40's Can't Help Falling in Love was topping the Billboard charts. A small little company by the name of Wizards of the Coast was getting ready to release a brand new trading card game onto the world. It is here that our history of Magic the Gathering vampires begins. Hello, and welcome to MTG. My name is Ken, and today we're continuing our series where we take a look back into the history books of the four major creature types of Ixalan. The last episode we covered dinosaurs, and today we'll be exploring the world of vampires in Magic the Gathering. This episode, we are doing things a little differently. The vampire creature type is expansive and diverse, spanning the entirety of the game and having multiple iterations. So for this episode, I wanted to dig in a little more into the lore and story behind these blood-crazed beasts. While still going in order of set release, I will be primarily focusing on the three specific planes, Innistrad, Zendikar, and of course Ixalan. We'll take a peek into each of these sets and see how the creature type has evolved, as well as try to identify the characteristics that make each plane's vampires unique. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's explore the frightening and decadent world of vampires in Magic the Gathering. Debuting all the way back in Alpha, our very first vampire card printed in Magic the Gathering was Sengir Vampire. This card helped create the identity in which many of the vampires to come would follow. The first defining characteristic was the flying keyword, the second being the card's relationship with creatures dying. This will be expanded upon as we move forward in time. Jumping ahead a couple years, we would see the release of Baron Sengir, the vampire in which the Sengir vampires descended from. Baron continued the tradition of gaining some sort of value off creatures dying, but this time he came with a form of protection with his regenerate ability. Now, a few more cards I wanted to mention as we move through these early years of the creature type are Vampire Dragon, the first non-mono black vampire introduced to the game. This legendary dragon was in Rakdos, a color pairing that would soon become synonymous with the creature type. Sadek, Lord of Secrets, was a vampire that founded the Dimir Guild in Ravnica, so of course its colors would reflect the guild, being blue and black. The last vampire I wanted to mention here is Garazol, Plague Queen. Like many of the OG vampires, Garazol wanted to see creatures die by her hand in order to pump themselves up with counters. This legendary vampire was also the first to sport three colors, blue, black, and red. Up to this point, those three colors seemed to be the quintessential vampire colors, as we made our way to the first Zendikar set. With the release of the original Zendikar block in 2009, we would see a brand new slew of mono-black vampires with their own unique lore. These fearsome creatures would be ruthless in their search for power and sustenance. The original vampires on Zendikar were actually devout followers of Ulamog that were corrupted into cannibalism as a way to gain strength, showing the power that a ceaseless hunger can produce. This wave of devotees would become the first in a line of vampiric blood chiefs. Some of the characteristics of the Zendikar vampires were the red markings on their faces and bodies. Some typal staples to come from the block included Bloodghast, a self-resurrection all-star, Butcher of Malakir, a 5/4 flying Graved Pact, and Pawn of Ulamog, a token generator that could net you additional mana. We see that the focus on creatures dying is still prevalent within the vampires of this set, as the identity of the creature type strengthens over time. Before moving to our next vampire juggernaut known as Innistrad, I wanted to quickly spotlight the Commander All-Star card Viscera Seer. Released with the Magic 2011 set, this one-mana vampire has remained one of the greatest sacrifice outlets to this day. So without a doubt, Innistrad is the most iconic location for vampire creatures, and is most often the first plane you think of when discussing the creature type. Interestingly, vampires weren't always around on Innistrad. Thousands of years before the setting of the original Innistrad block, a rather unknown alchemist named Edgar Markov, we'll get to him, was in search of a solution to cure his people from famine. This led Edgar down a path that would see him perform blood rituals, enabling himself and anyone who succumbs to the ritual able to feed off of blood. Modern scientists, take notes. As time moved on, the vampires of Innistrad would become entranced in luxury. Four of the bloodlines would stand above the rest in class and nobility. Those families were the Markovs, the Falconwrath, the Stormkirk, and the Valderan. Moving on to the defining characteristics of Innistrad vampires, we would see the return of red as a predominant color, meaning once again Rakdos would become the quintessential vampire colors. As for mechanics, while creatures dying still mattered for many cards, we started to see a shift towards the more combat-focused strategies. In particular, we saw quite a few creatures that would get stronger after dealing combat damage. As for the standout cards from this block, we would see the leader of the Valderan house, Olivia Valderan. This Rakdos flyer sought to turn your opponent's creatures into vampires and then turn their newly formed vampires against their opponent. Falconwrath Aristocrat, the original aristocrat as well as the namesake of the archetype. and Blood Artist, arguably one of the best vampire creatures to this day, and is every aristocrat player's favorite win con. Moving on past the initial Innistrad block, we took a quick stop back into Ravnica, where we see a few more vampires terrorizing the lands. Necropolis Regent debuted and returned to Ravnica and sported a counter-focused strategy. We also saw the return of Dimir vampires in cards like Mirko Voss and Duskmantle Seer. Nearing the end of 2015, we would see Magic return to Zendikar for a two-part battle between the Gatewatch and the Eldrazi Titans. With this block, we would see the return of the mono-black focused vampires. While the characteristics we came to expect with a vampire creature type were there, we began to see a growing emphasis on life gain, with the newest batch of Bloodsuckers. We also saw a few exceptions to the mono-black rule with cards like Drana's Emissary and Cliffhaven Vampire. With 2 out of 3 of the Eldrazi Titans defeated, we would return to Innistrad, where the final and most formidable Eldrazi would be imprisoned inside the moon. This would be the catalyst for the next 2 sets, Shadows over Innistrad as well as Eldritch Moon. The first of the 2 sets kept pretty close to the Innistrad vampire mold. We saw the return of Olivia, as well as a few notable one-drop creatures like Indulgent Aristocrat and Falconwrath Gorger. Speaking of Gorger, the Madness mechanic would be seen in quite a few of these new cards. Madness states, if you discard this card, discard it into exile. When you do, cast it for its Madness cost or put it in your graveyard. This would add a whole new strategy to the vampire archetype. Eldritch Moon saw the effect of Emrakul's power, as many of the existing creatures on the plane would be turned into Eldritch Horrors. One example of this is with Valdarin Pariah, who on her front side is a pretty run-of-the-mill vampire, but when she flips, she turns into Abolisher of Bloodlines, a nightmare-inducing monster. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the vampires on Kaladesh. While there weren't many, Kaladesh had its own form of vampires. These Aetherborn were able to drain life essence from people in order to extend their fleeting lifespans, as typical non-vampire Aetherborns only live to be around 3 to 4 years. The most famous of these vampires being Yahenni Undying Partisan, another sack outlet for your vampire token strategies. Released in the summer of 2017, Commander 2017 saw the introduction of the Vampiric Bloodlust Precon, and with it, our first look at the juggernaut that is Edgar Markov. This commander sported white, black, and red in its color identity, meaning the largest majority of vampires up to this point would be viable options for this deck. Edgar also sported the Eminence ability, meaning even from beyond the battlefield, you would continue to feel the effects of this commander. For every creature you would cast, you would get an additional 1/1 black vampire creature token. Due to its color identity, as well as its frankly busted abilities, Edgar would become the vampire commander that would stay this way for many, many years. Well, will you look at that, we finally made it to Ixalan. Since I went over the set in detail in my dinosaur video, I thought I would just jump straight into the identity of the vampire creature types on Ixalan. While white was beginning to be seen on some vampire cards, it was Ixalan that cemented the white and black vampire identity. This iteration of vampires sported a conquistador aesthetic, and notably were not vulnerable to the sun. Life gain and life loss were common themes seen with this archetype of Ixalan vampires. Death triggers and attack triggers too continued to be seen. Some notable cards include Mavrin Fane, Bishop of Rebirth, Champion of Dusk, Twilight Prophet, and of course Alinda the Duskrose, a channel favorite and token strategy all-star. Okay, for the next few sets we're going to go rapid fire as there's still plenty to get through. The War of the Spark block brought with it more blue and black vampires, M20 introduced a few more staple vampires, and shortly after, Commander 2018 brought with it the Merciless Rage deck, being helmed by Ange Falconwrath. This Rakdos commander looked to capitalize on madness mechanics mentioned prior. M21 saw the release of Vito Thorn of Dusk Rose, who would become a very fast win con for any life game strategy. Our final return to Zendikar, as of the recording of this video at least, we would see the party mechanic play a prominent role in this set. Because of this, every new vampire introduced would fall under the category of either warrior, cleric, rogue, or wizard. Strixhaven had vampires featured in both the Witherbloom and the Silver Quill schools. These creatures were less mechanically unique, and more so aligned with their houses mechanically. With the chaos of the Emrakul Moon somewhat behind us, the next Innistrad set was all about the Eternal Night and the threat of werewolves. This didn't mean that there weren't vampires though. There were quite a few new vampires that would become staples in both Commander and other formats. Some of these cards include Bloodthirsty Adversary, Slaughter Specialist, and Florian Voldarin Scion. The set immediately following Midnight Hunt was Crimson Vow, a set focused around the marriage between Olivia Valdarin and Edgar Markov. This totally legit, not for any other reasons in love, wedding brought with it some fantastic vampire guests. Welcoming Vampire, Henrika Domnathy, Cemetery Gatekeeper, Vildarin Epicure, Blood Tithe Harvester, and Falconwrath Forebearers, just to name a few. The vampires in the set introduced the blood tokens into the game. These artifacts sacked itself to let you rummage, aka discard a card to draw a card. These new tokens meant that you could now have the option to make a vampire artifact deck. As you may have guessed, both Olivia and Edgar received new cards. While Olivia Crimson Bride still remained black and red, Edgar had been downgraded to only black and white. Both make for great commanders and are much more balanced than the previous iterations. The commander deck that came alongside Crimson Vow also had a vampire theme, this time utilizing the aforementioned blood tokens. Streets of New Capenna saw some new vampires. These creatures all yielded from the Maestros family, meaning they all fell under the blue, black, and red colors. Sets like All Will Be One and March of the Machine saw some one-off vampires yielding from the various planes. Alinda returned to team up with Azor, Dusk Legion Duelist was a great counters payoff card, and Markov Baron was an anthem effect with Convoke and Madness. Okay, we have finally made it to the most recent set, and with it came a whole new cast of Orzhov Fiends. Vito makes a return, along with two new characters, Baltalmir and Amalia. We also saw some top-end bombs with Bringer the Last Gift and Bloodletter of Alcatots. The majority of the new vampires came in the Blood Rites Precon, helmed by Clavlenio, First of the Blessed. This deck, which sported a demonic sub-theme, featured cards like Alinda's Hierophant, as well as Charismatic Conqueror, who at the time of this recording has skyrocketed in price. This precon did a fantastic job utilizing all the vampires that had come up to this point. And just like that, we have covered the history of vampires from the very beginning to now. With such a robust history, it has been very interesting to see how the creature type has evolved and how their identity has changed. Now I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the vampire archetype? Are there any cards I didn't include that you think need mentioning? Please let me know in the comments. Also, if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel, you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. In the next episode of the series, we will be taking a peek inside the world of pirates. But until then, have a good one, and I will see you next time.